Support Name Explain on Patreon for ad-free videos, exclusive podcasts and blog posts, and to help choose what names get explained. Click the link in the description. In some ways, languages are a lot like living beings. Like us, they are born. However, by being born, it means they also have the ability to die. While some languages have been spoken in one form or another for thousands of years, others have not been too lucky. Over the span of human history, we have lost so many languages. Mighty tongues like Latin spoken by the dominant Roman Empire have ceased to be used, and one can only begin to imagine how many native tongues of the Americas have been lost over the years. We aptly call these languages dead languages. Side note, a dead language is any language that does not have a native speaking community, hence why Latin is considered a dead language, despite the fact it can still be learned and is spoken. When a language dies, it normally isn't the most spectacular of events. It tends to be just the last few elders of a bygone time slowly passing away, taking the language with them. A notable example is with the Ayapenacu language of Mexico, in which the last two native speakers of the language didn't want to talk to each other. Supposedly they just never got along. However, there's conflicting reports as to whether this was actually the case or not. It's a fun story that's worth sharing nevertheless. Regardless, most languages go out with a whimper. One language in particular, however, went out with a bang, quite literally. This is because its last native speaker died in a literal explosion. Talk about a dramatic end for a language. This combustible language was the language of Dalmatian. You may have heard of Dalmatia. It isn't its own nation but rather a region in the modern nation of Croatia. It is located across the southern tip of the nation and along Croatia's west coast / the east coast of the Adriatic Sea. It's a part of Europe with a very rich history and has changed hands many times, being its own kingdom at one point in the larger Austrian Empire. Though perhaps Dalmatia's biggest legacy in the modern world is a certain breed of dog from this land which shares its name. Dalmatia is more than just a land area, however, as once upon a time they had their own language too, the aforementioned Dalmatian. While modern Croatia is considered a Slavic country and their language of Croatian being Slavic too, Dalmatian was actually a Romance language. It's believed to have come from the Vulgar Latin spoken by the old inhabitants of the Balkans, the Illyrians. This means that it was not only shaped by the original Latin, but has been influenced by other languages too, such as Italian, and perhaps more importantly, Venetian. More on that language in a bit. This means Dalmatian was a Romance language amongst a sea of Slavic speakers. This might seem odd at first, however I'm sure you know this isn't the lone Romance language of Southeast Europe. Fairly close by is the nation of Romania, another Romance-speaking nation. It was thought in the past that Dalmatian was something of a missing link language between Italian and Romanian. However, further studies have determined that Dalmatian actually links more closely to the Western Romance languages, like France and Spanish, as opposed to Romanian. Even before its death, Dalmatian was a kind of difficult language to pin down. It was spoken across all the cities of Dalmatia. However, everywhere it was spoken, a completely different dialect was used. On top of this, it was primarily an oral language, meaning very little of it was actually written down. Obviously, this array of dialects and the lack of written evidence didn't really help in its demise. What didn't help either was how small of a speaking population the language had. Even at its peak, there was just an estimated 50,000 speakers. That's enough to fill the Aloha Stadium in Honolulu, apparently. Impressive in one way, but for a language, it's not that many people. When it was widely spoken, the place in which it was spoken most was the city of King's Land, Dubrovnik. In Dalmatian, this city had a completely different name, however, Ragusa, which is the same as the city's Italian name. As mentioned, everywhere the language was spoken, it had a different dialect, and this dialect was aptly named RAGUSAN Dalmatian. The earliest written record we have of Dalmatian comes from Dubrovnik in the 13th century, though it most likely was being spoken prior to this. As I mentioned, they didn't write too much of this language down. However, we also know that by the 16th century, Dalmatian was already dead in Dubrovnik. Across Dalmatia, the language was slowly dying and other tongues were used in its place. Eventually, Dalmatian was spoken in just one part of Croatia / Dalmatia, that being on the island of Kirk, or as it was called in Dalmatian, Vikla. This name relates to the island's Italian name too, being called Verglia in Italian. This once again was however a completely different dialect of the tongue, being called Veglia to Dalmatian. The language was able to survive here due to the island's ties to Venice and the Venetian language. When the Venetian Republic was a thing, this island was a part of it, meaning this Romance language could coexist with its fellow Romance language of Venetian. Venice's time as an independent republic came to an end, however, in 1797. No longer being part of a Romance-speaking nation, this meant that this tiny Romance language's days were numbered. As the years went by, the island of Kirk came under rule of a variety of different empires. Austrian rule began on the island after the fall of Venice, and for a spell it was under Napoleonic rule. This meant that the language of Dalmatian started to disappear, with inhabitants speaking other languages instead. As this language was spoken by such a small amount of people, and so little of it had been written down, it meant that it had barely been preserved. Dalmatian remained unpreserved all the way until 1897. It was in this year that someone had the bright idea to actually try and document this tongue before it disappeared forever. This was a great idea, however there was one issue. By 1897, there was only one native speaker of the language left alive. This lone native speaker was a man by the name of Torno Ordena. He was born in 1823 and held a few different jobs during his life. He worked as a marine postman and as a church caretaker. There doesn't seem to be any information as to whether he had a family of his own or not. I'm sure you can gather from all this that Torno Ordena was a pretty ordinary person who lived a pretty ordinary life. He would have remained an unknown. However, his position as the last Dalmatian speaker made him incredibly valuable. It was the Italian linguist Matteo Bartoli who sought out this man in 1897 to study and record the language he spoke. Though by 1897, however, Torno Ordena was not perhaps the best person to be the sole possessor of an almost extinct language. Dalmatian was not his first language, it was the first language of his parents. He learned to speak it by listening in on their conversations. He only really used it to speak to them, and by 1897 his folks had been dead for 20 years, meaning he had not really spoken it for about 20 years. Also, by this time he was 74 years old and had lost most of his teeth. I am by no means an expert on language, but I'm pretty sure teeth were important for speaking. Not only was he not the best subject to extract the language out of, Matteo Bartoli was not seen as the greatest linguist by any means. He was certainly capable and had a great understanding of language, specifically focusing on the geographic spread of languages. However, he was by no means an absolute expert. The highly influential Italian linguist Giacomo Devoto talked about Bartoli, saying that taste for phonemics, syntax, stylist, general grammar, and the description of a system in general remained foreign to him, which is perhaps a statement I relate a bit too much to. Nevertheless, these two were our best shot at preserving the Dalmatian language. A 70-something-year-old man with no teeth who hadn't spoken it properly in 20 years, and a linguist who was by no means at the top of his field. They should be the stars of a sitcom or something. Despite being something of a linguistic odd couple, they got to work. Bartoli spent a huge amount of time with Ordana and listened to him speak the language and share his stories, making sure to note down as many words and phrases in the language as he could. His final study on the language, Das Dalmatische, contained almost 3,000 words, phrases and stories from the language shared by Ordana. On top of this, Bartoli explained the language's phonology and grammar in the study too, well, as best he could. To this day, Bartoli's study is the only complete description of the Dalmatian language that we have, containing all known text and information that we have on the language. However, the original Italian version of this study kind of got lost. Before it went missing though, Bartoli translated it into German, which is the most well-known version, hence why the study's title sounded so German when I mentioned it a moment ago. It was only in 2001 when the German version was retranslated back into Italian. Bartoli researched the Dalmatian language with Ordena in 1897, which is incredibly lucky, as in the following year of 1898, the language's last active speaker, Torno Ordana, met his end. He was a pretty old man at this stage, but that doesn't mean he died in a peaceful way or in his sleep or anything like that. As mentioned, he went out with a bang. He was literally blown up. On the 10th of June 1898, Torno Ordana was caught in an explosion. What caused this explosion, however, seems to be a topic of dispute. Some sources claim it was an accident due to some roadworks, while other sources claim it was an old landmine going off. Perhaps it was a mixture of the two and some roadworks activated an old landmine. The book this video is heavily inspired by, Lingo by Gaston Doran, says landmine, so I'm more inclined to go with that. Whatever the case, this explosion certainly happened, and poor Torno Ordana was certainly in the wrong place at the wrong time, as this explosion took him out. This explosion not only killed him, but also the Dalmatian language he and only he spoke natively. The death of a language is always a sad thing, that's for sure, and explosions are terrible, destructive things. However, out of all the ways for a language to meet its demise, a huge explosion is a pretty badass way to go out, that's for sure. You have to wonder what the chances of the last speaker of a language being killed in an unexpected explosion are. Stranger things have happened in the world of language, but this is up there. We have an exact date for the death of the Dalmatian language, something we don't get all that often, the 10th of June 1898. Though, has the language remained dead since then? Well, it might sound crazy at first, but we can actually bring languages back from the dead with enough time, study and commitment. In example, the death of the last native Manx speaker on the Isle of Man is seen as happening in 1974. However, it has since been revived and is being talked by more and more, with the island even being home to a Manx-only school. Manx is by no means thriving, but it's not as dead as we thought it would have been in the 1970s. Is there any chance that Dalmatian has had the same kind of revival? Well, not quite, but the work and study carried out by Matteo Bartoli has allowed the language to be spoken once again. There are reportedly 20 people across the globe who are fluent in Dalmatian to this day, with a few hundred more who have some understanding of the language. On top of this, however, we have the Istriot language, another Romance language spoken on the Istrian peninsula of Croatia. In 2017, this language was classified as part of the Dalmatian Romance subgroup, meaning Dalmatian has a relative that is still living to this day, although there are only thought to be around 400 or so native speakers of Istriot. If you happen to speak this language, or one of the 20 or so people that can speak Dalmatian fluently, then please do us all a huge favour and try to avoid stepping on any landmines. Thank you to all my patrons who support Name Explain on a monthly basis. Patron is vital to Name Explain, and donating just $2 a month allows you to enjoy ad-free videos and bonus patron exclusive content. It also allows you to help choose what names get explained in upcoming videos, and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you so much for all the support you guys give Name Explain. Thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. Check out another video and subscribe to stay in the loop on all things Name Explain. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram where I'm Name Explain YT, and also join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain, both of which will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.